I think you want to put this in a slight historical perspective. If you go back to about 1992, 1993, and what was coming out of the climate change models, there was a fairly general belief among the climate change specialists at the time that climate change would not have much impact on the tropics and subtropics. There was a belief that it would primarily affect the temperate latitudes. I remember, in fact, I looked at some of my own lecture notes from 35 years ago, and that was the kind of line that was suggested then. Nobody really knew what was going to happen, but it looked like it would be mainly temperate zone impacts. That changed, as I understand it, with the modelling of the early 1990s, which showed that the tropics and subtropics would have a major impact from climate change. It was certainly true that the Paleoarctic, the near Arctic, would be most affected, but it wouldn't just be the northern and southern temperate zones. And I think the early era of climate change understanding suggested that, yes, this was going to be where it would have the impact, but these were the richest countries of the world. They would be more able to cope. The absolutely important change was what happened in the early 1990s, when it became recognized that the tropics and subtropics would be affected, and affected probably in three broad ways. One, long-term, admittedly, would be sea level rises. Two, much shorter term, would be in the much greater intensity of tropical storms, partly because of the changing energy content of the oceanic systems. But three, and most important of all, would be major changes in rainfall distribution. I always remember one of the best articles on this was by David Rind in New Scientist in 1995, which he called Drying Out the Tropics. And what he was saying was that although the modelling was not expected to be fully accurate, at least the tropics would be affected in a very major way, relatively rapidly. And the key thing is you have to put that together with the socioeconomic divisions. That's the real crunch. So what one sees actually is if, for example, as we expect, there will be a major drying out phenomenon across much of Amazonia, and across much of the Middle East and North Africa, and quite possibly much of China as well, the impact is going to be absolutely massive, because you have very large numbers of people still largely engaged in subsistence agriculture, dependent for their food intake from stuff which is grown locally or at most districtly. And we're dealing with the possibility of really major decreases in food production capability. The kinds of impacts that we're likely to see of when people are on the margins, know they are on the margins, when the socioeconomic divisions don't make their lives any better and they know it, and then you have environmental factors coming in, this is where you get the real security implications. The modelling is by no means accurate, but at a rough guess, it is probable that over the next 30 to 40 years, the kinds of migratory pressures which we experience now for justified economic means, desperate people trying to get better lifestyles, will probably increase by a factor of 10. We currently have about 20 million people who migrated across boundaries because of need. That will probably rise to about 200 million. Now, the impact on receiving societies, the politics of that, will be tremendous. And the problem is that migrants will be seen, quotes, as threats. Everything will be put in threat terms. Now, let me come back to this, because this is actually, in many ways, what is happening now. I get the opportunity, I'm very lucky in that I'm able to lecture quite often at defence colleges. I was lecturing at the RAF Air Power Conference last week with 300 RAF officers. And you look at what the military think tanks are saying, and the very interesting thing is that if you look at the very sharp think tanks like the Concept Centre down at Shrivenham and the reports they're doing on long-term security threats, they will single out the rich wealth-poverty divide, they will single out climate change. In fact, what I've said so far would just be straight through and they would agree with virtually every word. But what they then go on, and it's perfectly natural from their point of view, is that their job is to secure this country on its own or in an alliance. And what they're not about, by and large, is actually trying to look at the longer-term issues and address them before they become security issues. In other words, the name of the game, as far as they are concerned, is, in a sense, to respond to these uncertainties by making sure that a country such as Britain keeps secure. And if you look at the changing military policies across the world, you see time and again that the thinking is going in the direction of maintaining the status quo. I'll give you several examples. You're probably aware that because of the risk of major population movements out of Bangladesh, largely because of climate change, India is now starting the process of fortifying the entire border between India and Bangladesh. The Australian Navy has just taken out of service some rather old and not very long-range maritime patrol boats, and it's buying much larger, longer range boats in larger numbers, because it sees the sea between itself and Southeast Asia, which may well be greatly affected by climate change, as being a much more important zone to police. The French and Spanish navies have tended to move to some extent away from the old preoccupation with the East-West conflict. They're much more concerned with basically patrolling the Mediterranean, because they see a long-term pressure coming from North Africa and possibly from West Africa as well. And you see this time again in that the response, from their point of view, fully understandable, is actually to respond by maintaining the current position, not going farther, not looking at the kinds of broad issues that we're discussing today. Does that mean essentially that we are really on a bit of a hiding to nothing to trying to change the entire paradigm? I'm not sure it does mean that, because in fact one of the almost the quintessential example of what you might call the control paradigm is how the war on terror has been fought over the last 7 years. That is absolutely classic in terms of what you might call old thinking, old military thinking. We had the disaster of 9/11, the atrocity of 9/11. You had the neocon view that you must regain control, and this had to be done by military means. We now, 7 years later, we know what is happening in Afghanistan, we know what's happened in Iraq, 100,000 civilians killed at least, 4 million refugees, and all the rest. Essentially, that old thinking, in military terms, the control paradigm, has not worked in this particular context, which means that we actually have an opportunity to open up the whole debate and say, well, if you can't actually get your systems to work in what is a relatively small-scale problem, and relatively speaking, terrorism is a small-scale problem, do you really think you can get your systems to work and maintain the status quo in terms of these really big trends we're facing? So I think in that sense, there is actually a potential opportunity for engagement, which I think is actually crucial. And the ideas that groups like Oxford Research Group are putting forward on sustainable security are actually hugely significant. What about the future? What are the possibilities? Well, just 2 or 3 ideas here, no more than that, so we've got plenty of time for discussion. I was recently at the Royal College of Physicians, and they had an all-day conference for medics on climate change and health. And in fact, Adair Turner was one of the speakers there. And what was very interesting was that the president of the Royal College of Physicians was saying, where we are now with climate change is where we as a medical profession were with smoking and cancer 40 years ago. And essentially, we have to see climate change as the biggest single public health issue of the next 50 to 100 years. And we as doctors have actually got to be speaking out, as we should have spoken out earlier, on smoking and health. It's an interesting idea, and I think it's an important one. One of the really big problems with this whole subject is a feeling that you cannot do anything about it, that essentially it's more or less hopeless. But just remind you 2 things. I see Dave Webb over there, Di McDonald here, myself, and some of you, I'm sure, were very much involved in anti-nuclear campaigning, 25, 30 years ago. I see 1 or 2 nods. If we were having a session on futures in this room 25 years ago in 1983, we would be absolutely concentrating on the risk of the nuclear arms race and the risk of all-out nuclear war. We would have been saying it is far more dangerous than the government says, and of course now we know that the archives have opened up, it really was far more dangerous than the government said, and we would be saying, you know, this is the biggest threat facing us. It was. We have partly got out of it, not entirely, but essentially the risk of an all-out global nuclear war is lower now than 25 years ago. Gorbachev did this annoying thing of removing our enemy. It's a complex process of how it happened in the late 1980s, but essentially we moved away from a period which was incredibly pessimistic. So that can happen, and things can happen relatively quickly.